Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of The Hunt. For those joining us for the first time, this is our weekly series dedicated towards helping hiring managers and job seekers navigate the world of recruiting. My name is Kevin Roth. I'm Managing Director of Advice Personnel. We're a boutique recruitment agency serving the tri-state area for over 35 years now, and we're bringing this forum to you to use our recruiting experience and navigating the hiring market and bringing advice and guidance to people that are in those situations every single day. And the beauty of this show and this forum is that it's meant to be interactive. So throughout the show, I encourage you guys to use the comment box. If you have questions, if you have scenarios or situations that you're facing, or just to say hello. Love seeing the engagement and being able to interact with anybody out there that's watching. But this show is meant to help you. And if you're in the middle of a job search, or you're hiring talent, or you're struggling with certain topics related to finding or landing a job, this is the forum that is meant to help address those questions. So use those comment boxes throughout the course of the show, and I'll get to as many questions as I can throughout the episode. But hope everyone's having an awesome week leading up to a nice holiday weekend. And with that said, we'll kick things off. And today's episode is, I think, one of the ones I was most looking forward to that I've done so far, because it's a topic that a lot of people struggle with. It's a scary situation to go through in life, let alone having to explain it to a new employer, and it could be absolutely debilitating. And the topic we're talking about today is getting fired. And even that word, like fired, has such a negative connotation. It feels like powerful and ugly and fierce. And it just has a very vicious tone to it. But the reality is a lot of people get fired throughout the course of their career. I'd say probably a majority of people in the workforce at some point in their career will get fired. Steve Jobs got fired at one point. Oprah notoriously got fired at one point. And it happens. So the biggest thing, before we even get into how to approach this question on an interview, is really coming to terms with the fact that getting fired, if you're out there and you got fired recently, it doesn't mean you're incapable. It doesn't mean you're less qualified. It doesn't mean you're not good enough. So before you start second guessing yourself, doubting your capabilities, losing confidence, it's so important to realize this happens every single day to people, whether they're great at what they do or whether they're limited in certain areas. And it can happen for a multitude of reasons, but it does not mean you're not good at what you do. And it does not mean you're not capable of going right back at it to a similar position or something in the same category. So for those of you watching that have gone through this and have unfortunately dealt with it, first, you have to realize that and maintain that confidence and positivity. And don't so much look at, do I now need to change things? Am I not good enough? But more so, what can I learn from this? And how can I move forward from this to make myself that much better? And it sounds cliche, but it is so true. So realizing that, you have to harness that positivity and energy. What we're talking about today is how can you possibly, you just got fired, now you're going to an interview for a similar job that you just were fired from. How is it possible to even explain that to a potential employer without them getting the association that, well, if you weren't good at this job before, what makes you think you're going to be good for it here? So it's a very scary question to go into, and a lot of people battle with it to the extent that you think, should I lie? Should I come up with a different excuse? Should I change kind of what happened? Maybe they won't find out. In reality, and I've had experience with this, and we've seen situations play out from the recruiting perspective, another cliche line, but honesty is the best policy. You're able to really harness this in a way that can come across positively, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So for those of you who have just been fired or have been on the job market for a while after getting fired, make sure you take note, throw your questions into the comment box if you're dealing with a specific scenario, and I'll get to those specific situations aside from the general topics that I'll approach now. But the first thing to figure out is when you're thinking about, should I lie? Should I not lie? How can I go about this? Can I use some sort of generic excuse? There's always a way to approach this in an interview. And the best thing is you have time to prepare. You can literally sit there and predict this question and practice with friends and family on different ways to approach it until you get that right formula. But the first thing to figure out before you do any of that is identify the problem and understand that even if you failed because you weren't necessarily great at this role, that doesn't mean you're not good for another position. There's a home for everybody, and different environments and setups and situations can harness and play to different skills and strengths. Even if it means going from one senior accountant role to another senior accountant role, there can be very different ways of working that can completely debilitate you as an employee versus others that'll really allow you to showcase your strengths and skills. So identify the problem, and admitting that you weren't good at this job does not mean you're a failure. So don't get caught into this defense mechanism that it was the company, they really didn't bring you along well enough, they weren't good managers. That could all be true, but find something intrinsically and really be true to yourself and be honest with yourself about what went wrong. Were you really giving everything you had? Some people in this COVID era, they found a job for the first time remote, and if you're going to be honest with yourself, you weren't giving it the same effort that you were when your boss's eyes were on you. And if you want to be real with yourself, the company's probably right for letting you go. Come to terms with that. It's not a bad thing. You're learning from it. Did you make some of the mistakes that they said you made? Were you a little in over your head? Maybe you oversold yourself on an interview and you were actually in over your head. That's not a bad thing to admit, as long as you can frame how you're learning from that and being better. So the very first step you need to take, if you got fired recently and if you've been trying to craft some amazing response to that question and trying to spruce it up and sugarcoat it, take a step back, really come to terms with the problem at hand and what led to your firing, and try to be as real with yourself as possible, because otherwise you're setting yourself up for failure in the interview process. Once you've identified that problem, now figure out how are you better from understanding that. In the past example, I mentioned you go into remote life, first time, in hindsight, you probably did check out a little bit. You probably were a little more lax. You probably weren't as checked in. So how did you learn from that? You learned your lesson now. This is a wake-up call for you, and you're better because it's been brought to your attention and you've seen the repercussions of what can happen if you do slack off. And now that's made you probably more motivated. You have this chip on your shoulder. You probably have a stronger work ethic. So learning from how are you better from this situation happening. If you were weak on certain areas for this job and you tried, but you kept kind of falling down, you couldn't really pick up, you were making silly mistakes, you weren't really checking in, your nerves were getting to you, and then the mistakes just compounded. In the movie The Replacements, Shane Falco talks about quicksand being scary. And he was using it as a metaphor to describe in quicksand, you get into a hole, the harder you fight, the deeper you sink. So maybe that was what was going on in a role that you were a little over your head in. So how are you better because of that? Maybe you've learned how to calm yourself down now. Maybe you've seen that you need to tailor your search towards a different role. So understanding how you've improved as a professional and a person from getting fired is important. So step one, identify that problem. And step two, really understand how are you better now because of what has taken place, and having the time to truly reflect and understand what happened. And again, if you're facing these situations and you have very specific scenarios that you're trying to navigate as to why you were fired in an interview, use the comment box and share those questions, and I'll make sure I get to those before we wrap up the show. All right, so now it all comes together. We know what the problem was. We've come to terms with it. We're being honest with ourselves that we had at least something to do with getting fired. The company might not have done us any favors, but at least understanding that we had something to do with that problem. And how are we better because of it? And now it's about crafting that story and bringing it together and being prepared to jump all over it. And I can't stress this enough. I do speak to people where I can tell the company had a lot to do with probably why you weren't successful. But in more cases than not, there was something there. Aside from just a one-off outlier company, it was a real bad place that just was using you and abusing you and let you go just to get some extra help. More often than not, even if the company's at somewhat fault, there's something that you could take away from this. There's probably something that you didn't do right that led to this decision. So understand that when you're interviewing, no matter how you put it on the company, it is always going to be assumed that you had something to do with it. So do not go into these interviews and blaming the company that you weren't really set up for success, you were misled, the company was not a good place. those things are always going to be taken with a grain of salt unless you bring your own self into it, and then it develops trust. If you're venting about everything negative but don't bring yourself in, they're assuming that you had something to do with it and you're not bringing that to light, so they think there's something you're hiding, versus if you just address it and get it out there and show the humility that you had something to do in this. So in terms of how you can present this, you have to really think about understanding the answers that we just described. Tell the story of what happened and why you're better because of it. What did you learn about yourself? How will this set you up to be a better employee? And in thinking about it, I use the acronym CPR. So thinking of CPR, you're resuscitating your career. CPR, confidence, positivity, and reality. All right? Confident. Come across with a level of conviction as to the reason you're giving. If you made mistakes and you were a little sloppy at this company, as bad as that sounds, come to terms with it and be real with it. Tell this company, in hindsight, you feel that you learned a lot from this experience. You really feel you fell short in a few areas in which you could have done a better job. And quite frankly, the company letting you go, in hindsight, is something that you think will be a positive turning point in your career because you've recognized those areas and you've become a better person because of it. And bringing that level of confidence to the conversation and a level of humility is going to increase the credibility that you have with that potential employer. So thinking of the example where you probably weren't giving it your all. Use COVID as an example. This is the first time a lot of us are working from home. So it's very humanistic to think that maybe that transition, you're learning on the fly here, and in hindsight, you probably weren't the greatest employee in that situation. So tell the hiring manager that. If you got let go because of work ethic and you were checked out and you weren't really engaged from home, be honest about it and share, in hindsight, this was like a really, really strange time. We got thrown into remote life. I had family at home, distractions, and I can be honest and say that I think I had a tough time acclimating to that home lifestyle and understanding kind of expectations. And now that this has happened, it's allowed me to reflect and really be true to myself and realize that. And I think I'll be that much stronger and that much locked in because of it. So that confidence level and being real is going to be well received by companies versus the typical fluffy answer. So it's so important to think with confidence, again, positivity, reinforcing that you're putting a positive spin on this. People have gotten fired throughout the course of history and bounced back and been greater because of it. So come in with that level of positivity, that you're happy this was brought to your attention. And even though you wish you were still with that company and would never want to be unemployed, you've had the chance to really reflect and see where your strengths are and understand your shortcomings. And you can't wait to get back in there to the right company and show them what you're capable of and really show yourself and prove to yourself that you can be an amazing, amazing addition to any team. So bring that positivity, bring that confidence. And the last one is reality. Don't get caught in the trap of trying to sell some glamorous, glorified view of what happened and putting it all off to the side, because if references come back around and that comes out, you have zero shot at getting that job. And regardless, you have probably less of a chance right now if you're being fluffy than if you're actually telling the truth and being transparent and honest. So in thinking about how to tell this story, if you got fired, number one, identify the problem. Number two, how are you better as a person and as a professional from this happening to you? And if you can come to terms with those two things and really be honest with yourself, then telling your story will really be that much easier. But make sure you remember CPR. And again, I use the thought of resuscitating your career and using the paddles on your career, but CPR, confidence, positivity, and reality. And if you can remember that and bring that into the conversation, you have the best shot, and you'll feel better about yourself going through this exercise than if you're trying to mislead each company and get lucky by skating through the process. All right, so with that said, I want to make sure we get a few questions answered as well. And in thinking about this, we have a few questions from Jenna. So Jenna asks, should you still ask for references? Will they disclose that you were fired? So that's the thing you got to prepare for. And that's why this is such an important conversation. If you were let go and you were fired, then theoretically that company should be fair game to receive a reference. If you're still employed at a company, oftentimes you can skate by that. You don't want your current employer to know you're still engaged there. But if you've been let go, most companies are going to want to check a reference. And even if you don't say you were fired and you give some different answer, still references are probably 9 out of 10 companies I work with check references. And the first reference they want is the most recent company and someone who is in a hiring position to you. So you have to really think long and hard before you go through this process and come up with an answer to this question. If you're not going to be honest about being let go and you want to say it was cutbacks or it was COVID related or anything like that, you got to really check yourself and think, is this going to come out? If they do a reference and they call my former boss, what are they going to say? And if it's going to be that you were fired for certain reasons or certain causes, it's not worth the risk. You can just as easily take the advice from this episode and play it to your advantage and be able to craft a response that really comes across confident, positive, and real. And that's going to be so refreshing and well received to the right company that's going to appreciate that, and it'll make you that much better because of it. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions right now, but if you're watching this and you were fired, don't lose confidence, stay positive, be able to come to terms with the fact that you can be better because of this and you can build off of this, and think in the mentality that the next company is going to be that much more fortunate to have you now than before you were fired, because you have such a greater sense of drive and conviction to see yourself succeed. And if you could bring that into any interview and bring that sense of realness and passion, then any company is going to be lucky and excited about the potential of getting someone like you on board and taking advantage of that. So I have one more question from Luther. So Luther's asking, what if you were fired over 10 years ago for violating a company policy that affected your licenses? Do you still need to disclose if the violation of company policy did not have legal ramifications? So Luther, that's a good question. And for people watching that are thinking about, you're not just coming off of getting fired, but it happened a few years ago or a few positions ago, how much do you need to disclose? And that's a little different situation. If it's 10 years ago, Luther, I think what I would figure out is I would look at your background, number one. Are you someone who has a history of a lot of job movement? And think about if your background has a few red flags where they're going to want to do more of a diligence check on you. If you're someone that's only had 2-3 jobs in a 20-year career, I wouldn't be as concerned about that one blip on the radar. But in terms of the reference that could come back and check that, it all comes down to circumstances. Again, I think if you got to look at your background and understand how many jobs ago was that. Most companies are not going to get references from a company that was 10 years ago, as long as you've had positions since then. If you've been out of work for 10 years and that's the last most recent job, then that'll likely come up. So if I were in your situation, Luther, I probably wouldn't necessarily address that unless they specifically asked me what happened at this particular company. In that case, I would want to take the same advice I gave throughout this show and be able to talk through it. So, Irina, you bring up a great point that in terms of confirming the circumstances of your employment or termination, a lot of companies are not authorized or are not able to do that. Having said that, you don't want to use that as a reason for misleading, because you never know the network that a company has, the people that they know. Everyone knows friends, references take place, and things do come to light. And if you were let go for cause and they happen to have a connection to somebody or know of the situation that took place, or I could tell you some crazy situations and stories that play out where this information gets back to you. So you're absolutely right. Well, it might not come from a formal reference where this company calls that company for a formal reference check to confirm. There are so many back channel scenarios and conversations that go on, no different than if you called an employee that had also worked for another company to see what they thought about that company before you decide to accept an offer. Companies do the same thing. And there's off the record conversations and casual discussions that take place to verify someone's credibility and capabilities for a job. So it's a great point to bring up that, yes, legally or based on company, a lot of companies will not disclose specific terms of your termination. there is still an inherent risk there. And I think it's really important to be upfront and transparent, because the last thing you want is to shoot yourself in the foot by going through a whole process and trying to mislead so that at the end, maybe you skate by and get lucky. So I think that's really important. But Irina, thank you so much, because that's a really important point to bring up. I don't want anybody getting scared that certain things are fair game. All right. So I thank everyone for the engagement, and I really hope this helps. I know a lot of people and a lot of you watching are scared. You go into these conversations, you get asked, you don't know, should you lie? Should you make something up? Should you use an excuse? But if you use these tips that I shared today, remember CPR. It's such a more rewarding experience to be truthful, be honest, not have to worry that something's going to come back to haunt you, and have a company that buys into you for you and sees the positivity that you're coming in with, and that you're someone who's learned from something, has that chip on your shoulder, and that'll be a really cool experience. So I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. I hope it was helpful. But as always, those that can't step away and watch this during the day, throw your comments in the comment box. If you're watching this after the fact, I go back and check these feeds, and I'll answer any questions that you have. But as always, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm tagged to this post. Make sure you follow Advice Personnel, because we're always putting content out there to help people as job seekers or hiring managers. And make sure you share this with friends, family members, colleagues, and get this stuff out there, because the more people hear this, I think the more we'll develop a greater confidence in the employee base and stronger people out there when it comes to finding and retaining jobs. So thank you everyone for watching. I appreciate and love the support and the interaction. I hope everyone has a great rest of the week, an amazing Martin Luther King weekend, and we'll be back next Thursday with a brand new episode of The Hunt. Thank you so much for tuning in. Take care.